So let's start over. I'm now in my sophomore year at college. My church is different. My friends are gone. Um, I'm starting over. The one thing I had was a walk with God, and now I desire to serve Him. My sophomore year was the hardest year of my life up to that point, and I really did a lot of soul searching. And I began, for the first time in my life, to grow up. I started taking things very seriously. This new church that we attended at Kazadel, where my dad was pastoring, there was just discussions, and because my dad becoming the pastor and different doctrines that were talked about that I'd really never thought about. I had had communion all my life, but I'd never thought about closed communion, close or open communion. I had been in church all my life, but why do we have the standards that we have? And I began a life change that continues to this day. I began to question everything, not in a negative way, but in a positive way. I began to question. I began to question in this, why are we doing this? Because I want biblical reasons. And I began to really get in the Word of God. Everything from the bride of Christ to where the church started, to alien baptism, to why my mom doesn't wear jeans, right? I mean, I just question and I want to know. And it wasn't in a rebellious attitude at all. It was out of a heart that sincerely wanted a basis for these things. And I began to study the Word of God and sit in class and, like a sponge, soaked it in. I'm working now at Whirlpool headquarters in St. Joseph, Michigan, and God's really stirring in my life, and I'm working there. And in the spring of that year, I went early to go to work. I drove myself, which I rarely ever did. I usually rode the bus with a bunch of other kids. And I pulled off the side of a little park, and I sat there. It's a beautiful place. You've never been. It's awesome. And I was tired. School was wearing me out. Just life change, different world, different life, new church. I just had a talk with God. I can take you to the bench. It's still there that I sat at that looks over Lake Michigan. And I just talked to God. And God said, look around you. He said, here's a town, big town, with not a gospel witness in it. Lutherans are there, Catholics are really there. Some Protestant churches, but a King James gospel preaching. God said, why don't you come here? Why don't you see a church started here? I began to pray about it. And long story, but on that bench, I surrendered to whatever God wanted. And I know at 16 I surrendered to be a preacher. But I mean, this was a Corinthians moment where it says, neither yield your members as members of unrighteousness, but yield yourselves to God. I said, God, I surrender all. God gave me a burden for St. Joseph, Michigan. It's 2021. I still have a burden for St. Joseph, Michigan. And I surrendered. God, I would love to see a church get started here. That became my focus. I began to grow, made some great friends that are still my friends to this day. Did well in college. I had a few moments when me and teachers didn't agree. One of the teachers had been baptized at a Bible church, and he was teaching Baptist distinctives and on baptism, and I said, doesn't that make your baptism illegitimate? And he didn't like that. I wrote my thesis paper for Life of Christ on who is the bride of Christ, and I got rebuked, and they wouldn't give me my paper back. The teacher, not the institution. But both those teachers aren't there anymore. But and I wasn't being a smart aleck. I really saw these things. And I began to grow, and I could get out of my shell, and I fell in love with kids' ministries and bus. Thanks, Fred Edwards is always be precious to me. Just my bus captain there, took me under his wing. I love him and his family so much. And he helped me in my worst year when I was so down that sophomore year. And then just enjoyed learning to love kids and serve and see people get saved. And I mean, just fell in love with the ministry. I got offers to go my senior year to go to a church in Illinois and be a assistant pastor there. And got an opportunity to go to New Hampshire and a few other places, New Mexico, and praying about all these things. But God said, go home. And I knew no greater place to train and to serve than at your local church. And so I went home, and Dad gave me a job. He said, your responsibility is to work with kids and start a school. Let's pick up there tomorrow.